They said the Calloway family was the most loyal, the most trustworthy, the most devoted enslaved family on the Beaumont sugar plantation in Alabama. 3 generations had served the Beaumont family with apparent dedication, Cyrus as the master cook, his son Jacob as the head stable master, and his grandson Isaiah as the personal valet to young Master Charles Beaumont. The white family praised the Calloways constantly, held them up as examples of good Negroes who knew their place and served faithfully. But loyalty was a mask. Devotion was a performance. And beneath the surface of 3 generations of faithful service lay something far more dangerous, a meticulously planned revenge that had been unfolding for 60 years. A conspiracy so subtle and so patient that no one suspected it existed, a vendetta that would ultimately destroy the Beaumont family from within. My name is Isaiah Calloway, and I am 28 years old in the year 1858. I am the 3rd generation of my family to serve the Beaumonts, and I am the one who will complete the work that my grandfather began in 1798, that my father continued, that I will finish. This is the story of how 3 generations of enslaved people outsmarted their owners through patience, intelligence, and strategic planning, and how one mistake nearly destroyed everything we'd worked for, forcing me to make choices I never anticipated, revealing truths I never wanted to know. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, at the moment when the seed of vengeance was planted, when my grandfather Cyrus Calloway made a vow that would shape the destiny of our entire family. The year was 1798, and Cyrus Calloway was 25 years old, working as a field hand on the Beaumont plantation in Alabama. He was strong, intelligent, and had a best friend named Samuel, who was like a brother to him. They'd grown up together, had survived the horrors of slavery together, had supported each other through years of hardship and suffering. Samuel was a skilled carpenter, valued for his craftsmanship, trusted by Master Richard Beaumont, the grandfather of the current master, to work on important projects. And Samuel had been secretly building something extraordinary. A hidden room beneath the plantation's main barn, a space where enslaved people could hide if they needed to escape, a sanctuary that could save lives. But someone betrayed Samuel. Someone told Master Richard about the hidden room, about Samuel's plan to help people escape, about his secret acts of resistance. And Master Richard, furious at this betrayal of trust, decided to make an example of Samuel. "You thought you could deceive me," Master Richard said to Samuel, who stood bound and terrified before him. "You thought you could use the skills I allowed you to develop to undermine my authority. You're going to learn what happens to slaves who forget their place." Master Richard ordered Samuel to be whipped, not the usual punishment of 20 or 30 lashes, but 200 lashes, a sentence that was essentially a death sentence that would destroy a man's body and spirit. And he ordered Cyrus to watch, ordered him to stand there and witness his best friend being beaten to death, to see what happened to enslaved people who dared to resist, to understand the consequences of defiance. Cyrus stood there for hours watching Samuel being whipped, watching his friend's back being torn apart, watching the life drain from his body. And Samuel in his final moments looked at Cyrus with eyes that conveyed both forgiveness and a plea. "Forgive me for being caught, but don't let this be for nothing. Don't let my death be meaningless. Find a way to make them pay." Samuel died that evening, his body broken, his spirit finally released from the torment of slavery. And Cyrus, standing over his friend's grave, made a vow that would echo through 3 generations. "I will destroy the Beaumont family, not quickly, not obviously, but slowly, methodically, over generations if necessary. I will use their trust against them, will infiltrate their household, will learn their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities, and I will ensure that they pay for what they've done that Samuel's death is avenged, that the Beaumont legacy crumbles into dust. It was an audacious vow, an impossible plan. But Cyrus was patient, was intelligent, was willing to dedicate his entire life and the lives of his descendants to this goal. He began by transforming himself from a fieldand into someone more valuable, someone who would have access to the Beaumont family's private spaces and intimate details. He taught himself to cook, learned from the plantation's elderly cook, absorbed knowledge about food preparation and kitchen management. And when the old cook died, Cyrus was ready to take over, was prepared to become the Beaumont family's trusted cook. "You're a good worker, Cyrus," Master Richard told him when offering him the position. "You've always been loyal, always been reliable. I'm promoting you to head cook. You'll be responsible for preparing all the family's meals, for managing the kitchen, for ensuring that we're well-fed. Don't disappoint me." "I won't, Master," Cyrus said, keeping his voice humble and grateful, hiding the satisfaction he felt at achieving the first step of his plan. "Thank you for this opportunity. I'll serve your family faithfully." And he did serve them, but not in the way they imagined, because Cyrus's position as cook gave him something precious: access to the family's most intimate moments, knowledge of their eating habits and their health, the ability to observe and record information that would be crucial to the long-term plan he was developing. Over the next 20 years, Cyrus meticulously documented everything he learned about the Beaumont family. He observed their food preferences, their allergies, their digestive issues. He noted which family members had weak constitutions, which had chronic health problems, which had conditions that could be exacerbated through careful dietary manipulation. And he developed a code, a system of symbols and notations that looked like simple kitchen records, but that actually contained detailed information about the Beaumont family's vulnerabilities. He recorded everything in a leather-bound journal that he kept hidden, that he would eventually pass on to his son, that would become the foundation for the family's multi-generational revenge. "This is knowledge," Cyrus would tell his son Jacob when the boy was old enough to understand. "This is power. The Beaumonts think we're ignorant, think we're incapable of sophisticated thinking. But we're observing them, learning about them, gathering information that will eventually be used to destroy them. Be patient, son. Be smart. Continue this work, and someday the Beaumonts will pay for what they did to Samuel." Jacob, the music, listened, absorbed his father's teachings, understood that he was part of something larger than himself, something that would require patience and dedication and a willingness to play a role for decades. When Cyrus died in 1838, at the age of 65, he passed the journal to Jacob, along with instructions for the next phase of the plan. Jacob, who'd been working in the stables since he was a teenager, had his own role to play, his own contribution to make to the family's revenge. And now, in 1858, it was my turn. I was the third generation, the one who would complete the work that my grandfather had started, her music, that my father had continued, that I would finish. The Beaumont family's destruction was approaching, and they had no idea that the loyal valet, who served them so faithfully, was actually the architect of their downfall. The seed of vengeance that had been planted 60 years ago was finally ready to bear fruit. And nothing would stop it, or so I thought, until one mistake, one unforeseen complication, one moment of human weakness, threatened to destroy everything we'd worked for and forced me to confront the true cost of revenge. My father, Jacob Calloway, was born in 1815, 17 years after my grandfather Cyrus had made his vow of revenge. He grew up hearing stories about Samuel, about the injustice of his death, about the plan that Cyrus was developing to destroy the Beaumont family. And from a young age, Jacob understood that he had a role to play that he was part of a multi-generational conspiracy that required patience, intelligence, and absolute secrecy. "Never forget what they did to Samuel," Cyrus would tell Jacob. "Never forget that the Bowmans are our enemies. No matter how kindly they treat us, no matter how much they praise our loyalty, they killed my best friend for daring to help others escape. They deserve to be destroyed, and we're going to destroy them slowly, carefully over generations if necessary." Jacob absorbed these lessons, understood the importance of the work his father was doing, recognized that documenting the Beaumont family's vulnerabilities was crucial to the long-term plan, and he began to think about his own contribution, about how he could use his position and his skills to further the family's revenge. Jacob had always loved horses. From the time he was a small child, he'd been drawn to the stables, had spent every free moment learning about horses, studying their behavior, understanding their needs, and Master Richard Beaumont, recognizing Jacob's talent, music had assigned him to work in the stables full-time when he was 14 years old. "You're good with horses, boy," Master Richard said. "Better than anyone else I've got. You're going to work in the stables from now on. Learn everything you can. Someday you might be head stable, master." Jacob threw himself into the work, learned everything about horses, their breeding, their training, their care, their diseases and injuries. And music, he became an expert, became someone the Beaumont family relied on completely for managing their valuable horses, for breeding champions, for ensuring that the stable operation was profitable. But Jacob was also thinking strategically, was considering how his knowledge of horses could be used to further the family's revenge, and he realized that the Beaumont family's wealth was closely tied to their horses. They bred racer horses, sold breeding stock, competed in races that brought prestige and prize money. If Jacob could subtly undermine the horse breeding operation, could ensure that the most promising animals had hidden flaws, could manipulate bloodlines in ways that would cause long-term problems, he could slowly drain the Beaumont family's wealth without anyone suspecting sabotage. It was brilliant. It was subtle. It was exactly the kind of long-term, strategic thinking that the family's revenge required. Jacob began implementing his plan in the 1830s when he became head stable master. He carefully studied the Beaumont family's breeding program, identified the bloodlines that were most valuable, understood which traits were desirable and which were problematic, and he began to make subtle changes, music breeding horses in ways that would produce animals that looked promising but had hidden weaknesses, manipulating bloodlines to introduce genetic flaws that wouldn't become apparent until the horses were older, ensuring that the Beaumont stable's reputation would gradually decline. "This colt looks excellent," Master Richard's son, Edmund Beaumont, the father of the current master, would say, examining a young horse that Jacob had bred. "Good conformation, strong legs, excellent temperament. He should do well in races." "Yes, master," Jacob would agree, knowing that the horse carried a genetic weakness that would cause joint problems in a few years that would prevent him from having a successful racing career that would ultimately cost the Beaumont family money and prestige. It was slow work requiring patience and careful planning, but over 20 years, Jacob's subtle sabotage had significant effects. The Beaumont stable's reputation declined. Their horses stopped winning major races. Music, their breeding stock, became less valuable. The family lost money, lost prestige, lost the competitive edge they'd once enjoyed, and no one suspected Jacob. He was the loyal head stable master, the expert who worked tirelessly to breed good horses, the trusted servant who seemed as disappointed as the family when their horses failed to perform as expected. "I don't understand it," Edmund Beaumont would say, frustrated by another racing loss. Jacob is the best stable master in Alabama. He knows horses better than anyone. Why aren't our horses winning anymore? What's going wrong? Maybe we've just had bad luck, father. His son, Charles, the current master, would suggest these things happen in horse breeding. Not every animal turns out to be a champion. But it wasn't bad luck. It was deliberate sabotage carefully executed over decades, designed to slowly drain the Beaumont family's wealth and undermine their status. And Jacob documented everything just as his father had done. He kept detailed records in code, noting which horses had been bred with hidden flaws, which bloodlines had been manipulated, which genetic weaknesses had been introduced. And he passed this information to me, his son Isaiah, along with the journal that Cyrus had created, along with instructions for the final phase of the plan. It's your turn now, Isaiah. Jacob told me in 1850, when I was 20 years old, and he was dying from a lung disease that had been slowly killing him for years. Your grandfather started this work. I continued it, and now you must finish it. The Beaumont family is weaker than they were 60 years ago, but they're not destroyed yet. That's your job. Use the knowledge we've gathered. Use your position as Charles Beaumont's valet. Use every advantage you have to complete the revenge that your grandfather swore to achieve. He handed me the two journals, Cyrus's journal documenting the family's health vulnerabilities and his own journal documenting the horse breeding sabotage. And he gave me specific instructions for what I needed to do, how I needed to use this information to bring about the final destruction of the Beaumont family. Charles Beaumont has a weak heart. Jacob told me. It's a hereditary condition that runs in the family. Your grandfather documented it, observed how certain foods made it worse, noted which family members were most affected. You need to use that knowledge, Isaiah. You need to manipulate Charles's diet in ways that will exacerbate his heart condition, that will weaken him gradually, that will eventually kill him. And the horses, I asked. The stable is already weakened, Jacob said. But there's one more thing you need to do. Charles is planning to make a major investment in a horse race next year. He's betting heavily on a horse he thinks will win, hoping to restore the family's fortune and reputation. You need to ensure that he loses that bet, that he invests everything in a horse that will fail, that the financial loss will be devastating enough to ruin the family completely. How do I do that? I asked. I've bred a horse specifically for this purpose, though Jacob said. His name is Midnight Runner. He looks like a champion. Perfect conformation, excellent speed in training, impressive bloodline. Charles will want to bet on him. Will think he's a sure thing, but Midnight Runner has a hidden flaw, a weakness in his respiratory system that will cause him to fail in a long race that will ensure he loses when Charles needs him to win most. Jacob coughed, his breathing labored, his body failing. You need to encourage Charles to bet on Midnight Runner, to invest heavily in that race. And when the horse loses, when Charles loses all his money, when his heart condition is exacerbated by the stress and the dietary manipulation, that's when the Beaumont family will finally fall. That's when Samuel's death will finally be avenged. He died 2 days later, and I buried him next to my grandfather in the slave cemetery, next to the graves of the people who dedicated their lives to this revenge, who'd passed the burden on to me. And I accepted that burden. I took the journals, studied them carefully, absorbed all the knowledge that 2 generations had accumulated, and I prepared to complete the work they'd started to bring about the final destruction of the Beaumont family. I was the 3rd generation, and I would not fail. I became Charles Beaumont's personal valet in 1851 when I was 21 years old and he was 25. It was the perfect position for the final phase of the plan. I had access to his private spaces, managed his daily routine, prepared his clothes and his personal items, accompanied him everywhere he went. I was closer to him than anyone except his wife, was privy to his thoughts and his plans, was positioned to influence his decisions in subtle but significant ways. Charles Beaumont was different from his father and grandfather. He was educated, had traveled to Europe, considered himself enlightened and progressive. He treated me with a degree of respect that was unusual for the time, would sometimes ask my opinion on matters, would engage in conversations that went beyond simple master-servant exchanges. "Isaiah," he would in music say, "what do you think about this shirt? Does it suit me for the dinner party tonight?" "It suits you very well, Master Charles," I would respond, playing my role perfectly, being the attentive valet who anticipated his needs and served him faithfully. But beneath the surface of our interactions, I was always observing, always gathering information, always looking for opportunities to advance the plan. I studied Charles's habits, his preferences, his music, his weaknesses, and I began to implement the dietary manipulation that my grandfather had documented that would gradually weaken Charles's heart and set the stage for his eventual death. The Beaumont family had a hereditary heart condition. My grandfather had observed it in multiple family members, had noted that certain foods exacerbated the condition, had documented which dietary choices made the symptoms worse, and I used that knowledge to subtly manipulate Charles's diet to ensure that he was consuming foods that would weaken his heart over time. I would suggest certain dishes to the cook, would recommend foods that I knew would be problematic, but would encourage Charles to eat in ways that seemed healthy, but that were actually harmful given his specific condition. "Master Charles," I would say, "the cook has prepared a wonderful beef roast with rich gravy tonight. It's your favorite, and I know you've been working hard. You should enjoy a hearty meal." Charles would have music eat the meal, would enjoy it, would never suspect that the rich, fatty foods I was encouraging him to consume were gradually weakening his heart, were setting the stage for a cardiac event that would seem natural and inevitable, rather than the result of deliberate manipulation. I also began working on the second part of the plan, encouraging Charles to invest heavily in the horse race that my father had prepared for, to bet everything on Midnight Runner, to believe that this was his chance to restore the family's fortune and reputation. "Master Charles," I said one evening in early 1858, "I've been observing Midnight Runner in training. He's extraordinary. I've never seen a horse with such speed and stamina. If you were to enter him in the Alabama Stakes this summer, I believe he would win easily. It could be a significant financial opportunity for you." Charles was intrigued. The family's financial situation had been declining for years. Music, the result of my father's subtle sabotage of the horse breeding operation, combined with poor investments and the general economic challenges facing southern plantations. Charles was desperate for a win, for something that would restore the family's wealth and status. "You really think Midnight Runner can win?" Charles asked. "I'm certain of it, Master," I said, lying smoothly, knowing that Midnight Runner had a hidden respiratory flaw that would cause him to fail in a long race. "He's the best horse your family has bred in decades. This is your opportunity to prove that the Beaumont stable is still the finest in Alabama." Over the next several months, I continued to encourage Charles to build his confidence in Midnight Runner, to convince him that betting heavily on this race was a smart investment. And Charles, trusting my judgment, trusting my apparent loyalty, and my knowledge of horses, decided to do exactly what I wanted him to do. "I'm going to bet everything on Midnight Runner," Charles told me in June 1858. "I'm going to mortgage the plantation, liquidate my investments, put everything on this race. If Midnight Runner wins, we'll be wealthy again. If he loses, well, I don't want to think about that. But I trust your judgment, Isaiah. You've never steered me wrong." I felt a moment of guilt hearing those words, hearing the trust in his voice, understanding that I was betraying that trust in the most fundamental way. But I pushed the guilt aside, reminded myself of Samuel, of the injustice that had started this whole chain of events, of the vow that my grandfather had made 60 years ago. The race was scheduled for July 15th, 1858, and everything was falling into place perfectly. Charles's heart was weakened by months of dietary manipulation. His financial situation was precarious. His hopes were pinned entirely on a horse that I knew would fail. The Beaumont family's destruction was imminent, and I was the one who would deliver the final blow, who would complete the work of 3 generations, who would finally avenge Samuel's death. But then, something happened that I didn't anticipate. Something that threatened to destroy everything we'd worked for. Something that forced me to confront the true cost of revenge, and to make choices I never thought I would have to make. The mistake came not from me, but from someone I'd never considered. Someone whose involvement in our plan I'd never imagined. Someone whose actions would reveal secrets that had been hidden for 60 years, and would force me to decide what revenge was really worth. The mistake came from my younger sister, Dinah. I'd never told Dinah about the family's plan for revenge. She was 15 years old in 1858, had grown up hearing vague stories about our grandfather and our father, but didn't know the details of what we'd been doing. Didn't understand that 3 generations of our family had been working to destroy the Beaumonts. Danina worked in the Beaumont house as a maid, was quiet and observant, was generally invisible to the white family in the way that enslaved servants often were, and I'd assumed she was simply going about her work, simply surviving slavery the way most people did, without any involvement in the complex conspiracy that I was managing. I was wrong. Dinah had been observing me, had noticed my subtle manipulations, had figured out that I was doing something deliberate to harm the Beaumont family, and in her teenage idealism, in her desire to help, in her misguided attempt to contribute to what she thought was a plan for resistance, she made a catastrophic error. She told someone about it. She confided in another enslaved person, a young man named Thomas, who worked in the fields, who she trusted, who she thought would understand and support what our family was doing. But Thomas was terrified by what Danina told him. The idea that enslaved people were actively plotting to destroy their masters, that they were manipulating food and horses and finances. It was too dangerous, too risky, too likely to result in brutal punishment for everyone if it was discovered. And Thomas, in his fear, did something that enslaved people sometimes did when they were terrified of being implicated in resistance. He told the overseer. He betrayed Dinah's confidence, revealed what she'd told him, tried to distance himself from the conspiracy by exposing it. The overseer, a brutal man named Samuel Morrison, ironically sharing the name of the man whose death had started all of this, immediately went to Charles Beaumont with the information. Master Charles Morrison said, "I've received disturbing information from one of the field hands. He claims that your valet, Isaiah, has been deliberately manipulating your diet to harm your health, and that he's been encouraging you to bet on Midnight Runner, knowing that the horse will fail. He says it's part of a multi-generational plot by the Calloway family to destroy your family." Charles was shocked. Couldn't believe what he was hearing, couldn't imagine that the loyal valet who'd served him so faithfully could be capable of such betrayal. "That's absurd," Charles said. "Isaiah is the most loyal servant I have. He would never do such a thing. This must be a misunderstanding. Or perhaps this Fieldand is trying to cause trouble. Perhaps, Master. Morrison said. But I think you should investigate. Question the girl who started this story, Danina Calloway, Isaiah's sister. See what she has to say. Charles agreed, and Danina was brought before him, terrified and confused, not understanding how her confidence to Thomas had resulted in this confrontation. Diener, Charles said, his voice stern, but not yet angry. I've been told that you've been spreading stories about Isaiah, about some kind of plot against my family. Is this true? Have you been making up lies about your brother? Danina was trapped. She could deny everything, could claim that Thomas had misunderstood or lied. But she was young, was frightened, was not prepared for this kind of interrogation. And in her fear, she made another mistake. She tried to defend me, tried to explain that what we were doing was justified, that it was revenge for something the Beaumont family had done decades ago. It's not a lie, Master Charles, Dina said, tears streaming down her face. Isaiah has been working to harm you. But it's because of what your grandfather did to Samuel, because of the injustice that started all of this. My grandfather swore revenge, and my father continued it, and Isaiah is finishing it. It's not about you personally, Master Charles. It's about justice for what was done to our family. Charles's face went pale. He stared at Danina, processing what she'd said, understanding the implications, realizing that the loyal Calloway family that had served his family for 3 generations had actually been plotting against them the entire time. Bring Isaiah here, Charles ordered. Now I was brought before Charles within minutes, was made to stand in his study, while he looked at me with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. Is it true, Isaiah? Charles asked, his voice shaking. Have you been plotting against me? Have you been deliberately trying to harm me and my family? I could have denied it. I could have claimed that Danina was confused, that Thomas had misunderstood, that this was all a terrible mistake. But looking at Charles's face, seeing the pain and betrayal in his eyes, understanding that the plan I dedicated my life to had been exposed, I made a choice. I told the truth. Yes, Master Charles, I said quietly. It's true. My grandfather, my father, and I have been working for 60 years to destroy your family. Not because of anything you personally did, but because your grandfather killed my grandfather's best friend, a man named Samuel, who was trying to help enslaved people escape. My grandfather swore revenge, and we've been carrying out that revenge ever since. Charles stared at me, unable to process what he was hearing. 60 years, 3 generations. All of this, your loyalty, your service, your advice, it was all a lie. You've been poisoning me. You've been sabotaging our horses. Her music, you've been deliberately trying to destroy us. Yes, I said, and it was working. Your heart is weakened. Your finances are precarious, and Midnight Runner will lose the race you're betting everything on. By the end of this summer, your family would have been destroyed, and you would never have known that it was deliberate, that it was revenge for something that happened before you were born. Charles looked like he'd been struck. He sat down heavily, his face pale, his hands shaking, and for a long moment he said nothing, just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Betrayal, yes, but also something else. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the complexity of what I'd revealed. What happens now, Master Charles? I asked quietly. Are you going to have me killed? Are you going to punish my sister for revealing the truth? Are you going to take revenge on the Calloway family the way your grandfather took revenge on Samuel? Charles was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his words surprised me more than anything I could have imagined. No, he said. I'm not going to have you killed. I'm not going to punish your sister. I'm not going to continue this cycle of revenge and violence, because I understand something now that I didn't understand before. That slavery creates these situations, that the injustice of this system breeds hatred and revenge. That as long as we treat people as property, as long as we deny them their humanity, we create enemies who have every right to want to destroy us. He looked at me directly. What my grandfather did to Samuel was wrong. It was cruel and unjust and evil. And your grandfather's desire for revenge was understandable, even if the methods you've used are disturbing. But I'm not my grandfather, Isaiah. I'm not the person who killed Samuel, and I don't want to perpetuate this cycle of violence and revenge. What are you saying, Master Charles? I asked, confused by his response, uncertain about what he intended to do. I'm saying that I'm going to free you, Charles said. You, your sister, and any other members of the Calloway family who are still enslaved on this plantation. I'm going to manumit you, give you your legal freedom, release you from bondage. Not because I approve of what you've done, but because I understand why you did it, and because I believe that the only way to end this cycle of revenge is to address the injustice that started it. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. You're going to free us after everything I've done? After I've spent years trying to destroy you? Yes, Charles said. Because revenge doesn't heal anything, Isaiah. It just perpetuates pain and suffering. Your grandfather's revenge didn't bring Samuel back. Your father's sabotage didn't undo the injustice, and your manipulation of my health and my finances won't create justice. It will just create more suffering, more death, more pain. So, I want to break that cycle. I want to do something different. He paused, his expression thoughtful. And I want you to tell me the truth about Midnight Runner. Is he really going to lose the race? Is my investment really going to fail? I hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Master Charles. Midnight Runner has a respiratory flaw that will cause him to fail in a long race. If you bet everything on him, you'll lose everything. That was the plan, to ruin you financially, and then let the stress and your weakened heart finish the job. Charles absorbed this information, then made a decision. Then I won't bet on Midnight Runner. I'll withdraw from the race, cut my losses, preserve what resources I have, and I'll use those resources to do something better, to free the enslaved people on this plantation, to try to make amends for the injustices my family has committed, to build something different than what my ancestors built. Why, I ask, why would you do this? Why would you show mercy to someone who's been trying to kill you? Because I believe in redemption, Charles said simply. I believe that people can change, that systems can change, that we don't have to be defined by the sins of our ancestors, and I believe that the only way to end cycles of revenge is through forgiveness and justice, real justice, not the false justice of revenge. He stood up, extended his hand to me. I'm sorry for what my grandfather did to Samuel. I'm sorry for the injustices my family has committed against yours. And I'm offering you freedom, not as payment for what was done, but as an acknowledgement that slavery is wrong, that you deserve to be free, that this cycle of revenge needs to end. I looked at his extended hand, at the offer of freedom, at the possibility of ending the revenge that had consumed 3 generations of my family. And I had to make a choice. Continue the plan that my grandfather had started, refuse Charles's offer and find another way to destroy the Beaumont family, or accept his offer of freedom and forgiveness. End the cycle of revenge. Choose a different path. It was the hardest decision I'd ever faced. And what I chose would determine not just my future, but the future of everyone involved in this 60-year conspiracy. I stood there in Charles Beaumont's study, staring at his extended hand, feeling the weight of 3 generations pressing down on me. My grandfather's vow, my father's dedication, my own years of careful manipulation, all of it had led to this moment, to this choice that I'd never anticipated having to make. Part of me wanted to refuse, wanted to spit in Charles's face, reject his offer of freedom, find another way to complete the revenge that had consumed my family for 60 years. Samuel's death deserved to be avenged. The injustice that had started this whole chain of events deserved to be answered with the destruction of the Beaumont family. But another part of me, a part I'd been suppressing for years, was tired. Tired of the deception, tired of the constant vigilance, tired of living a lie, music, tired of dedicating my entire existence to destroying someone who, as Charles had pointed out, wasn't actually responsible for the original injustice. I need time to think, I said, not taking Charles's hand, not committing to anything yet. This is not what I expected. I need to process what you're offering. I understand, Charles said, lowering his hand. Take the time you need. But Isaiah, understand that if you refuse my offer, if you continue trying to harm me or my family, I will have no choice but to protect myself. I'm offering you a way out, a way to end this cycle of revenge. But that offer won't remain open indefinitely. I left the study, my mind racing, my emotions in turmoil, and I went to find Danina to talk to my sister, who'd inadvertently exposed our family's secret, who'd forced this confrontation that I'd never wanted to have. I found her in the slave quarters crying, terrified that she'd destroyed everything, that her mistake would result in punishment for our entire family.
I'm sorry, Isaiah,
she sobbed when she saw me. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to help, wanted to be part of what you were doing. I didn't know that Thomas would betray me, that he would tell the overseer. I've ruined everything. You haven't ruined everything, I said, sitting beside her, putting my arm around her shoulders. You've actually done something that might be more important than revenge. You forced a confrontation that revealed truths that needed to be revealed. That created an opportunity for something different than what our grandfather planned. I told her about Charles's offer, about his decision to free us rather than punish us, about his desire to break the cycle of revenge. And Dina listened, her tears gradually stopping, her expression shifting from fear to hope. He's going to free us, she asked. Really? After everything you've done? That's what he says, I confirmed. He understands that what his grandfather did was wrong, and he wants to make amends by freeing us, by trying to do something different than what his ancestors did. What are you going to do? Ender asked. Are you going to accept his offer? I was silent for a long moment, wrestling with the decision, thinking about my grandfather and my father, about Samuel and the injustice that had started everything, about the 60 years of planning and dedication that had brought us to this point. And I thought about what Charles had said, that revenge doesn't heal anything, that it just perpetuates pain and suffering, that the only way to end cycles of violence is through forgiveness and justice. I'm going to accept his offer, I said finally. I'm going to take the freedom he's offering, and I'm going to end the revenge that our family has been pursuing for 3 generations, not because the Beaumonts don't deserve to be punished for what they've done, but because continuing this cycle of revenge won't bring Samuel back, won't undo the injustices of slavery, won't create the kind of justice that actually heals. Danina looked at me with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. But what about grandfather's vow? What about everything our family has worked for? Are you just going to abandon all of that? I'm not abandoning it, I said. I'm transforming it. Grandfather wanted to destroy the Beaumont family because of the injustice they committed. But maybe the better revenge, the more meaningful justice, is to accept freedom when it's offered. To build a life that honors Samuel's memory by living freely rather than by perpetuating violence. To prove that we're capable of choosing forgiveness over revenge when given the opportunity. I went back to Charles Beaumont the next day and accepted his offer. He prepared manumission papers for me, for Danina, and for the 3 other members of the Callaway She Music family who were still enslaved on the plantation. And in a ceremony that was both simple and profound, he signed those papers, officially freeing us from bondage. "You're free now, Isaiah," Charles said, handing me the document that declared my legal freedom. "You're no longer my property, no longer subject to my authority. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want, build whatever life you want. And I hope that you'll use your freedom to create something positive, something that honors the memory of Samuel and all the others who suffered under slavery." "Thank you, Master Charles," I said, then corrected myself. "Thank you, Charles. I will use my freedom well, and I will tell the story of what happened here, of how 3 generations of enslaved people outsmarted their owners through patience and intelligence, and how one act of mercy and forgiveness ended a cycle of revenge that could have continued for generations more. But the story didn't end there, because Charles Beaumont's decision to free us had consequences that neither of us had fully anticipated. Consequences that would reveal the complexity of what we'd done and the price that would be paid for ending the cycle of revenge. Charles' decision to manumit multiple enslaved people attracted attention from his neighbors, from other plantation owners who saw his actions as dangerous and subversive. They pressured him, threatened him, warned him that freeing slaves would encourage rebellion and undermine the entire system of slavery. "You're making a mistake, Beaumont," one neighbor told him. "You're setting a dangerous precedent. If word gets out that you freed slaves who were plotting against you, every enslaved person in Alabama will think they can get away with resistance. You need to reconsider this decision." But Charles refused. He stood by his choice, defended his actions, argued that slavery was morally wrong, and that he had a right to free his own property if he chose to do so. The pressure intensified. Music, Charles's social standing declined. His business relationship suffered. His reputation was damaged. And the financial strain, combined with the stress of defending his decision, took a toll on his health, specifically on the heart condition that I'd been exacerbating for months through dietary manipulation. In September 1858, 2 months after he'd freed us, Charles Beaumont suffered a massive heart attack. He survived, but he was weakened. Was told by doctors that he needed to reduce stress, that his heart couldn't handle the strain he'd been under, and I felt responsible because, even though Charles had shown mercy, even though he'd freed us, and tried to break the cycle of revenge, his heart condition had been weakened by my deliberate manipulation, and the stress he was experiencing was partly the result of the decision he'd made to free us. I visited him in his recovery, brought him food prepared by someone else, not by me, sat with him, and talked about what had happened. "I'm sorry, Charles," and I said, "I'm sorry that my actions contributed to your illness, that the dietary manipulation I engaged in has left you with a weakened heart. I know you showed me mercy, and I music feel guilty that you're suffering partly because of what I did." Charles looked at me with tired eyes. I knew the risks when I made my decision. "Isaiah, I knew that freeing you would have consequences, that it would create problems for me, but I still believe it was the right thing to do, and I don't regret it, even if it's cost me my health and my social standing." "Why?" I asked. "Why was it so important to you to free us, to show mercy to people who were trying to destroy you?" Because I believe in redemption, Charles said. I believe that we're not defined by the worst things we've done or the worst things that have been done to us. I believe that we have the power to choose differently, to break cycles of violence and revenge, to create something better than what we inherited. And I wanted to demonstrate that belief through action, not just through words. He paused, coughing. And because I understood something when you told me about your family's plan, that slavery creates these situations, that it breeds hatred and revenge. That as long as we treat people as property, we create enemies who have every justification for wanting to destroy us. The only way to end that cycle is to end slavery itself, to acknowledge that it's wrong to free people and give them the opportunity, music, to build lives of dignity and purpose. Charles Beaumont died in November 1858, 3 months after freeing us, his weakened heart finally giving out under the strain of illness and stress. And I attended his funeral, stood among the mourners, felt a complex mixture of emotions. Guilt for my role in weakening his heart, gratitude for his mercy, respect for his courage in standing by his principles, even when it cost him everything. The Beaumont plantation was sold after Charles's death. His widow and children moved to a smaller property, their wealth and status significantly reduced. The multi-generational plan that my family had pursued for 60 years had ultimately succeeded in destroying the Beaumont family's prominence and prosperity, but not in the way we'd intended and not without costs that I'd never anticipated. I lived as a free man for the next 37 years, dying in 1895 at the age of 65, and in those years of freedom, I built a life that honored both the memory of Samuel and the mercy that Charles Beaumont had shown me. I became a teacher, educating formerly enslaved people, helping them learn to read and write, preparing them for lives of freedom and opportunity. And I told the story of my family, the story of how 3 generations of enslaved people had outsmarted their owners through patience and intelligence, how we pursued revenge for 60 years, and how one act of mercy and forgiveness had ended that cycle and created an opportunity for something different. Revenge is seductive. I would tell my students it gives you purpose, gives you a goal, gives you a sense that you're fighting back against injustice. But revenge also traps you, consumes you, defines your entire existence in relation to the people who've harmed you. And sometimes the greatest act of resistance is not revenge, but forgiveness, not destruction, but redemption. Not perpetuating cycles of violence, but choosing to break them. I also told the story of the mistake, of how my sister Danina's inadvertent revelation had exposed our family's plan, had forced a confrontation that I'd never wanted to have, had created an opportunity for mercy and forgiveness that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Sometimes our mistakes lead to better outcomes than our carefully laid plans. I would say sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually save us. Danina thought she'd ruined everything by revealing our secret, but actually she created an opportunity for something better than revenge. She created an opportunity for freedom, for redemption, for breaking a cycle that had consumed 3 generations of our family. Before I died, I passed on the 2 journals. My grandfather's journal documenting the Beaumont family's health vulnerabilities, and my father's journal documenting the horse breeding sabotage. But I also added a 3rd journal, my own account of what had happened, of the choice I'd made, of the mercy that Charles Beaumont had shown, of the lessons I'd learned about revenge and forgiveness, and the complexity of justice. This is our family's history, I told my children and grandchildren. This is the story of how we outsmarted our owners, how we pursued revenge for 3 generations, and how we ultimately chose forgiveness over destruction. Remember this story, learn from it. Understand that resistance takes many forms, That justice is complex. That sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying our enemies, but from accepting mercy when it's offered, and using our freedom to build something better than what we inherited. I was buried in the cemetery of the community I'd helped build on land that had been purchased by formerly enslaved people in a place that represented freedom and opportunity rather than bondage and suffering. And on my gravestone they inscribed words that captured the essence of my life. Isaiah Calloway, 1830–1895. 3 generations of his family outsmarted their owners through patience and intelligence. But one mistake revealed their plan and created an opportunity for mercy, forgiveness, and redemption. A man who chose freedom over revenge and built a legacy of education and hope. The story of the Calloway family's 60-year conspiracy became a legend in our community. A tale told to inspire and to warn. A demonstration that resistance takes many forms, that intelligence and patience can accomplish what violence alone cannot, but also that revenge has costs, that cycles of violence perpetuate suffering, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing forgiveness over destruction. 3 generations of slaves had outsmarted their owners. But one mistake had changed everything, had exposed the plan, had forced a confrontation, had created an opportunity for something better than revenge. And in the end, that mistake had been a blessing rather than a curse, had led to freedom rather than to continued bondage, had demonstrated that sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually save us. This is our story. This is our legacy. And this is our message that resistance is important, that fighting against injustice is necessary, but that revenge is not the same as justice, that cycles of violence perpetuate suffering, and that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from destroying our enemies, but from accepting mercy when it's offered and using our freedom to build something better than what we inherited. The echoes of the Calloway family's extraordinary conspiracy reverberate through time. A powerful reminder that resistance requires patience and intelligence, that revenge can consume generations, and that sometimes mercy and forgiveness create better outcomes than destruction ever could. When Cyrus Calloway watched his best friend Samuel being whipped to death in 1798, when he made a vow to destroy the Beaumont family over generations, he set in motion a conspiracy that would span 60 years and 3 generations, demonstrating that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated long-term planning and strategic thinking that their oppressors never suspected. The brilliance of the Calloway plan lay in its subtlety and its patience. Cyrus documented the Beaumont family's health vulnerabilities through his position, cook. Jacob manipulated the horse breeding program to slowly drain the family's wealth and reputation, and Isaiah was positioned to deliver the final blow through dietary manipulation and financial sabotage. But Denina's mistake, her inadvertent revelation of the family's plan, created an unexpected opportunity for something different than revenge, forced a confrontation that revealed the complexity of justice and the possibility of redemption. Charles Beaumont's decision to free the Calloway family rather than punish them, to show mercy rather than perpetuate the cycle of revenge, demonstrated that individuals can choose differently than their ancestors, that systems can be challenged from within, that forgiveness can break cycles of violence. Isaiah's choice to accept that mercy, to end the 60-year conspiracy, to choose freedom over revenge, showed that sometimes the greatest act of resistance is not destruction, but the willingness to accept redemption when it's offered, and to use freedom to build something positive. The story raises profound questions about the ethics of revenge, about whether multi-generational conspiracies are justified by historical injustices, about the costs of dedicating entire lives to destroying enemies rather than building futures. If these untold stories of strategic resistance and moral complexity resonate with you, join our community to discover more hidden truths. Stories of those who used intelligence to fight oppression, who made difficult choices between revenge and redemption, who prove that resistance takes many forms. Your support ensures these powerful narratives continue to inspire. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What does the Calloway family story teach us about revenge, forgiveness, music, and justice? Let us know which untold tale you'd like to hear next.